Welcome to the Fort Collins Fellows podcast. From Colorado State University to New Belgium Brewery and the hundreds of miles of hiking and biking trails, Fort Collins has earned its well-deserved reputation as one of the top places to live in the United States. Your hosts, Patrick and Chris, were born and raised in Fort Collins. Patrick owns and runs Soukup Real Estate Services, a top-rated real estate brokerage company here in Fort Collins. Chris is the co-owner of the Murphy Group, a top-rated residential mortgage broker based out of Fort Collins. Now join the fellas as they uncover the stories, places, and people that make Fort Collins so exceptional.
Yes, in my backyard. We have got a group with us today that has been making some noise over the last couple of years in Fort Collins. And for good, having a voice for those that maybe didn't have a voice before. So we have got on the show today, Yimby of Fort Collins. Welcome to the show, Yimby.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks for having us.
Talk to us a little bit about kind of the origin story of Yimby, yes, in my backyard, and how it got kind of its start in Fort Collins, because I'm sure it's not a new thing per se, but maybe a little bit newer to Fort Collins.
Yeah, absolutely. We started, and Peter and Chris, feel free to chime in here. We started really in response to the first petition against the land use code in Fort Collins. A lot of us got flyers from folks opposing what to us looked like a really great pro-housing revision to the land use code. And so many of us contacted the Yimby Denver chapter about what was going on in Fort Collins that they said, hey, there's a group of you guys who are contacting us. Perhaps you should start your own chapter. So those of us, kind of the first little group, met at Bean Cycle and decided to become a chapter of Yimby Action, which is a national pro-housing organization with chapters all over the country and a few internationally as well, so that we could kind of leverage the resources, training, and really just the support network of the National Yimby Action Group to make our chapter more effective.
I was going to say, I didn't know there was multiple chapters.
Oh yeah.
And I was just going to say real quick for the podcast listeners, this is our largest we've ever had. We got 3 guests with us right now, with Christopher Conway and Peter Erickson, and then Kate Conley. So just want to get your names out there, a formal introduction for you guys.
Sounds good.
Talk to us a little bit about kind of then maybe the national mission statement and maybe the focus then on a more localized level for Fort Collins.
I could speak to this a little bit. I think that, Yimby is not actually that old an organization. It's only a little over a decade old in concept. And there are these stories that came out of especially public hearings in California about this young woman named Sonia Traus, who was a high school teacher and who started showing up to public hearings and making noise about the urgent need for more housing, especially in California and in these really hot housing markets that we have in the West. And the thing that I find so remarkable about her story and that I found personally inspiring was that she really, people kept asking her in the hallways, who are you with? Are you being paid to be here? Is the developer paying you? You're not a neighbor to the project. You're just here to advocate for more housing. And people couldn't figure out what was happening. What was she doing? Who was she with? Who is this person? And I think that was really part of my own origin story in getting involved in housing politics. Was I'm not a practitioner. I have no connections to developers. I teach German language courses at CSU here in Fort Collins. But I started showing up to hearings for projects that I cared about. And most especially the Oak 140 project, affordable housing development that was going in 4 blocks from my house. And it was a project that I really felt like I needed to support. They needed to hear from neighbors that felt the urgent need for this kind of housing in their own neighborhoods. That's the yes in my backyard component. So that was my own story. And going to that hearing and hearing people love to say that they support affordable housing in the abstract, but when it comes to a project in their own neighborhood, the criticism can often be withering for those who have listened to one of these zoning and planning meetings. So I was like, we need to get organized. We need to communicate with each other so that we can coordinate making appearances at these kinds of hearings to advocate for these kinds of projects.
What is this is maybe kind of a ridiculous question, but you hear the term affordable housing all the time in the news, the national media, local town squares. Like, in your eyes, what does affordable housing mean? Is it multifamily? Is it, hey, the cost of the home needs to be this? Like, in your eyes, what does it mean? And like, I see Kate, you're smiling. Like, what does it mean to you guys? What is affordable housing for your vision and for your organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. We can kind of split it up into two categories. One is what we call capital A affordable housing, which is deed restricted, usually has some level of government funding, often low-income housing tax credits coming from the federal government. It tends to be nonprofit housing developers who are building that housing. These are my clients. I'm an architect. I design mostly affordable housing, and they do tend to be multifamily because you're trying to take best advantage of whatever site you've gotten your hands on. There's also attainable housing or naturally occurring affordable housing, which is that lowercase a affordable housing, which is just homes that people can afford.
Yeah.
So we do come at this kind of like cross purposes in language when we're talking with people. Like, do you mean you support affordable housing or affordable housing?
Right.
And so we do try and really clarify that affordable versus attainable, because that means different things to people in the industry and outside of the industry.
I think it's a very important point about Yimby as an organization, that they argue both for more housing options. So on the one hand, and for deed restricted, subsidized, affordable housing on the other. I think that's really what makes us stand out from some previous iterations of housing activism, say market urbanism and Ed Glazer, and some of these economists who have advocated for more building for a long time. I think what stands out about Yimby is that we advocate for both. We need subsidized, deed-restricted, affordable housing, but we also need more market rate housing. We need to get a grip on the market. So the way I like to put this is we need to bend the curve on housing prices generally. And we don't necessarily have a lot of confidence that that's going to help people making below median area income. So we need deed-restricted affordable housing also. And that's kind of critical to our mission and who we are as an organization.
I know Fort Collins has like their goal is, I think, to add 10% affordable housing stock, but they've only been like scratching right around 5%. And do you see us ever even is it going to be something to where we need like an all-encompassing plan of, instead of 3 to 4 years through the planning and zoning departments, it's 12 months, or expedition of affordable housing projects versus kind of market rate projects, so to speak? It's one of those things where, let's talk about, we've got 3 locals to Fort Collins and we've got 2 transplants from California. And is there going to be enough building to help offset how many people are moving into Fort Collins or want to move into Fort Collins with what is currently there with our current housing stock, or how long it takes to build houses, the current regulations? I don't envy your uphill battle that it seems like you guys are fighting.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to solve the solution with the current policies that are in place now. But I think if we put the right policies in place that people are trying to push, with the new land use code in Fort Collins, with some of the bills that have been pushed at the state level, then there is a real possibility that we can, bring down the house of housing in Fort Collins in a real way. And you've seen that in certain places. But the key is that those places tried to change the way they did housing, right? And so I think one of the bills coming through the state legislature, right, is going to, make it easier to build housing without as much parking in it, leave it up to the developer instead, or the home builder, instead of having the city mandate how many. Other ones are trying to promote how much housing gets built around transit, and things like this all kind of play a small part to getting us to our goal. And I think Peter's absolutely right that it's kind of an all of the above approach. Like, it's not going to be one silver bullet. It's going to be pushing against all the different little regulations that have built up over time and all the things that are stopping people from being able to have a home that they can feel good about and really make their home.
So you guys don't like mill levies. I'm going to take it right now. I know my clients don't either. We can get into mill levies. Well, Chris,
I would also, sorry,
yeah, Kate.
just to add on to that, I would also challenge that it's just to deal with the supply of people moving into Fort Collins. Chris grew up here and a lot of his friends have had to leave. Like, it's people who are born here who also can't afford to buy homes here, even though their parents could. Like, people who've been longstanding members of the community are also leaving because of housing prices. And I think there's a really strong effort on the part of folks who oppose changes to land use policy to tie all of the growth in Fort Collins to immigration. And it's this very like immigration scary sort of line of rhetoric that they've chosen. And there's a lot of people who are non-immigrants who also can't afford to live here, and I want to make sure that that's
absolutely.
Like,
I mean, I'm a perfect example of the kind of population growth that is also making it hard to afford housing, right? Like, my parents moved here; they were 2 people, they needed 1 house, and me and my 3 siblings came into this world, and now we need 4 houses, or 3 or 4 houses to house all of us, right? And same with all my friends, and I'm hoping to have kids someday, and so they're going to need houses too at some time. And it's kind of one of those things where I'm part of that movement that's going to be driving the need for more housing, like, as well as my students, right? My students are also a great example. They're going to graduate from high school shortly, and they're going to need a place to live. And I don't think we want to be the town where that's unrealistic for people.
It's so hard because, like, Patrick and I, we're in the real estate. I'm in the lending side. Patrick's a real estate agent, and I just had a closing yesterday, and an incredibly great family that moved here from Virginia, and they moved here because they love beer and hiking in the mountains, and he can work remote. And I think we're seeing a lot of, and Patrick can talk about this for sure, and what he's doing with his YouTube channel. And just, it's like people love Fort Collins, and now there's this ability to work remote, and they're going, I want to live in Fort Collins. And there's just, I mean, like Patrick said, man, I do not envy the battle you guys have, but I support it. And like, I lived in San Francisco. I think, Peter, you were in the San Francisco area. And I have stories of my parents living in Atherton 45 years ago where houses were $100,000. And now those houses are 5 million. Like, it can get out of control that much. So it's really fascinating to see kind of where we are. We have a great place to live, but how do we accommodate, like you said, Christopher, your kids that want to grow up here and buy a house and everything like that? And it's a tough chore. But there's to that immigration. I don't hear a lot about the immigration, Kate, but it is out there. But in my mind, I'm going, God, there's a lot of people that just move here and that can work remote. And like COVID kind of changed that whole dynamic a little bit. So I just kind of want to make that comment that I'm seeing that personally through my business.
Real quick, I want to. Okay, so let's chat about. We had a guest on that discussed there seems to be a playbook that has been built now to overcome or challenge policies that have been passed and supported, but a small group can upend, the Sanctuary at the Greens, Corbett Drive, Polestar Village. Polestar Village got passed through, but who says that they don't go and hire an attorney now and say that then, so there's these playbooks that are being built by a minority, so to speak, that how can we overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to city council about this, and we've been in sessions with them trying to understand why this kind of vanishingly small number of people have the power to repeal certain aspects of law in our city and put extremely complex documents up for referenda. And, our mayor has kind of stood by the process. And I respect her for her strong take on that. She thinks, 10% of the last group who voted is fair. She suggested that perhaps the signatures should have to come from every district in Fort Collins. I don't know if I agree with her on that point, if that would make it any better or worse. But what that tells us is that we really need to tackle these issues from policy standpoint. And by that, I mean statewide policy. Every state that has passed kind of that higher level statewide legislative solution has given municipalities that are trying to do the right thing, and for us, the right thing means more pro-housing policy, the cover to do so, right? Like council can try and satisfy this group of, 4,000 to 6,000 people as much as they want, and they're not making any headway in getting any kind of consensus or compromise. And so if the state comes in and passes ADUs at the state level, suddenly Fort Collins is in the position of saying like, hey, we have to do this. We just need to figure out how. So I think that just the lessons that we've learned from the pro-housing movement in other states is that for certain particularly sticky issues, it just takes that kind of statewide overview in order to push things through at a local level.
Feels a little Big Brother-ish, though. Like it feels a little bit like, how do you treat Paxton, Colorado? Now, I know that there's distinguishing factors. I think population sizes and transit areas and things of that nature. So I'm not saying, I guess, not overwhelming, but man, it gets a little nerve-wracking that, but at the same time, I agree with you. To get us across that finish line for something like this, maybe that's what has to happen, because there's kind of like these little gaps that people can figure out and kind of upend something that's seemingly so good. And but it's the first time that they're kind of going through this, I know we had chatted about it last year, but it was a massive package. Now that I think they've kind of paired it off into like really smaller packages, trying to pass each kind of individually. But it was a little like disconcerting. I was like, that's like a big deal for like all of the state of Colorado, and I just don't know how much I like that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a couple ways that the state addresses that exact concern. One is that a lot of the housing legislation, not all of it, but a lot of it is focused only on what are called MPOs, which are metropolitan planning organizations, overlays. And so it only applies to like city areas. So you're not applying a policy that only makes sense for an urban or suburban area to a very rural area. Another thing that a lot of the bills do is kind of use like a carrot approach rather than a stick approach, which is like, hey, if you set housing goals and meet them, you unlock these funding sources. Like you can opt out, but you're not going to get access to these funds. The transit-oriented development or transit-oriented community bill that's coming out is like that. So there are ways to kind of preserve that, no pun intended, preference for local control. If certain cities want that, but if cities want access to funds, then they can meet the requirements of that legislation. So those are ways that those concerns have been addressed that I think are clever and not unique to this state.
Which are we at risk of? Obviously not, because Housing Catalyst got Prop 123 funds, but is the city at risk with their kind of delayed approach or delayed ability to pass anything that's kind of for affordable housing? And that seems like, well, I think they released, was it like 30 or 50 million bucks, and Housing Catalyst got like $1 or $2 million to buy land essentially?
Yes and no. And sorry, I feel like I'm answering all these questions. But the piece that I think you're talking about that's in the new version of the land use code that's required in order for Fort Collins to remain eligible for Prop 123 dollars doesn't technically need to be passed for a few years.
Okay.
I want to say the deadline's 2026. Don't quote me on that. But we do need to get that through in order to remain eligible for Prop 123 moving forward, which is really important. And honestly, like to a certain extent, it makes sense to piecemeal out the updates to the land use code to get those pieces through if we can't come to a better compromise. So I've kind of understood council's decision to try and strip the land use code down to those individual components and kind of tackle them one at a time. Do I love it? No, but I understand the decision making because of that added layer of trying to remain eligible for Prop 123 dollars.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that the state approach kind of makes sense in a lot of ways, because I think people see that decisions that one city makes can affect the whole surrounding area. And so relying on each individual city to make these decisions is a tough proposition, especially when we see a group like Preserve Fort Collins being able to kind of hijack the city process, like in Fort Collins, right? We know that if Fort Collins doesn't make some adjustments, then Wellington, Windsor, Loveland are all going to get unaffordable. And in fact, they are all becoming unaffordable as we speak, right? And we've seen
I saw
bad
Greeley's
actors.
median sales price like in the mid fives, like just
Yeah.
Peter just told me about that. Yeah.
I was like,
Which-
what?
and it's
Really?
insane.
No.
And
Yeah, they
see,
came out with
Greeley's one of
sales.
those-
The home values are up like 5% year over year. I mean,
Yeah,
everybody's waiting for home values to kind of go down, and they're doing the exact opposite.
well, part of the reason I got involved was because I was a teacher sitting around looking at my coworkers driving 40 minutes to come into town from Greeley, from Longmont, from places that are cheaper than Fort Collins. And I was just looking around being like, is this the city I grew up in? I don't remember this being the kind of place that I remember when I was a kid, right? And it was just shocking. And so trying to solve those problems, watching people drive home after a long day of teaching and like trying to get dinner on the table for their families and missing soccer practices. It's just not a tenable situation for a teacher who's already not making that much money to be driving, an hour and a half every day to Greeley to come work and educate Fort Collins' children.
Is the Front Range passenger rail system anything that's somewhat exciting, or is it such a pie in the sky? Such a pie in the sky, not going to happen type deal.
Go back to my European visits. I love going to Europe and taking the trains from town to town.
The executive director of the National Yimby organization once said that there's a Venn diagram of people who advocate for housing and people who like trains. There's almost a kind of perfect overlap.
It's a circle.
Two things. So there's, it's perhaps no coincidence that people who find, mid-range density to be appealing also are advocates for public transit. So I think these things certainly coincide. And I do find that that's a common problem that we have in talking to people in Preserve Fort Collins about the kind of future that we envision. I hear at public hearings all the time, people talking about us turning downtown Fort Collins into Manhattan, because that's the only form of density that they can imagine, that they have seen images of on TV is, it's either single family homes or it's, like New York skyscrapers. And I think it is important to imagine that another future is possible. You can have moderate levels of density built around transit that allow for just more walkable, livable, bikeable communities. And that's something that I hope for Fort Collins. And it has to be said that you don't have to travel to another country to see this kind of density. You can walk around Old Town. This is a part of the town that was not built around the automobile, that was built in a different era prior to the car, where you really see this kind of mixed use urban development that we all love. It's one of the reasons why Old Town is such a spectacular part of our community.
Patrick, remember was it Clay we were interviewing? We were talking about how Remington was going to be the northbound.
Matt Rovenel.
Yeah, when he's talking about that was going to go right through Old Town as like the northbound freeway, and College was the southbound freeway. We're like, are you serious? He goes, yeah. That was
kind of like what happened in Loveland, I guess. With so the state highway was going to split in half.
Yeah,
interesting.
Talk to me. Oh gosh, I just lost what I was going to say. Which talk to me a little bit about our growth is expected to be to 250,000 people by I think like 2050 or something like that. And if we adopt these kind of infill projects, densification of Fort Collins, are you suggesting that we could increase that number, or we would just get to that number quicker, or because is there going to be too much of a strain? I think it's our growth management area allows for that growth to 250,000 people eventually. And I don't know why there's kind of that cap. Maybe you guys could help me understand a little bit better. Would we increase that if we were able to do infill and add density, or what? How do they get to that 250,000 fictitious number of a cap?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to, first of all, I think that the policies that we're trying to enact are trying to meet the challenge of that number, not increase it in any way. And I would love to see that growth thoughtfully incorporated within the currently developed area of Fort Collins, because when we don't do that, we sprawl into our green spaces, which are another aspect of our city that people move here for and love. Chris, you mentioned it yourself at the top of the hour. People come here for the hiking, the mountain biking, the reservoir, all these beautiful places and open spaces that are clearly show so much love has been put into the development of this city and this region. That's where housing has to go if we don't densify the land that's already developed. And there's this notion that somehow this spread out, sprawly, single family residential is like green and environmentally friendly, when in reality, making better use of land that's already paved, already developed, already has utilities going to it is the greenest possible solution and the best for the environment. It keeps commute times low. It keeps our carbon footprint smaller. So it's the environmentally right way to house 250,000 people by 2050, is to do it within our current boundary.
I do think it's also worth mentioning that this is a national housing crisis, of course. And to a certain extent, we can try to pass statewide legislation that will help us as a region on the Front Range cope with this demand. But I like to joke with the people in Preserve Fort Collins that I'm in touch with that if they want that number down, they should be cheering for more housing development in Denver and in Los Angeles and in San Francisco and in Oregon and in Minneapolis, precisely the places that have been loosening up their housing regulations and trying to build more. So, I actually am scared of that number, to be totally honest. I think that that's going to be a very difficult level of demand to meet as a city. I'm worried about it. And to a certain extent, if you're worried about it too, the best thing that you could do would be to advocate for pro-housing communities nationally and across this country, because that'll help with the number of people who've also been displaced by the housing markets on the coast and have turned to Fort Collins as a more affordable option.
Do you think part of the battle in our area is we have Fort Collins, we have Timnath, Wellington, Love, we have all of these other towns, and getting everybody on the same page? Because Timnath to me is Fort Collins. Loveland to me is Fort Collins. It's all just, I was born and raised here, born in 1980, and there was a distinct boundary to all of these little communities. And now that's no longer. I just feel like you got to get everybody on board to say, hey, we can't just have Fort Collins do it, because we're all just basically one big city now. And it's not really a question here. I'm just kind of thinking out loud of that's just a challenge I see. We just interviewed the mayor of Timnath, and they're getting things passed much faster than Fort Collins, but we're all right next to each other.
I was going to say, we're the bad neighbor in that situation.
And Jenny Arndt and we love Jenny. And she told Patrick and I, she goes, it shouldn't take this many signatures to get something on my desk. And I think, I love Jenny. I think she's done a good job, but there's got to be some sort of collaboration to tackle this whole project. Montava is going in, but that's technically not in Fort Collins city limits, Montava. So, where does that play in everything? But to your point, Peter, I like that idea of a community where you can walk to the grocery store. You can walk to, there's biking. There is I live on College and Prospect, and which is really interesting because we have a lot of multifamily in our neighborhood. Right across the street, I have a couple duplexes, and around the corner we have fourplexes. And one of our friends, they tore down a house, and he had to get approval from the city to build a duplex, and it took a long time. And it's a beautiful 2-bedroom, 2-unit. It's gorgeous. He did a great job, but I'm like, Adam, how long? He's like, oh my God, I'm fighting this, I'm fighting that. And to your point, Kate, that's part of the affordable housing hurdles that we need to get over is let's have a little bit of common sense in this. If somebody wants to build a very nice fourplex in this area, they should be able to do it and not take a couple years. So
that's
my rant.
Go ahead, Peter.
part of this is a different understanding of how zoning should work, right? We should have a clear, comprehensible set of rules that if your duplex is allowed in your zone and it's under the height limit and it has a certain setback from the property line, you should be able to build that duplex. Mm-hmm. So partly what we're advocating for, and this was of course behind the land use code, was to make those kinds of things easier to build, because it wouldn't be subjected to this very strange process that I think a lot of people don't quite understand. What people tend to think of these local hearings as an opportunity to voice opposition to a project and kill it. But of course, in theory, these commissions are there to enforce regulations that the city has laid out in advance. And if we are only clear and about those regulations in advance, this whole process could be much less painful for everyone.
Which okay, so that's a great segue into how are you educating people about, okay, so there could be some negative connotations with different groups, names, all that kind of stuff, but how are you educating people on, like, we're just simply trying to make it easier and more equitable for people to build deed restricted affordable housing and have market rate attainable housing is kind of the overarching fact. That's all we're trying to do. But how are you kind of conveying that there's so many little nuances to that, yeah, if we're going to do this, it's a concerted effort. I feel like it's just so much.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of our charter is education. We have educational events all the time. I've been in an event with Clay Fricky, and I've been in educational events with the Habitat folks, Care Housing. You know, we try and bring in the people who are most affected by these regulations to help make the connections between the land use code and how that actually affects the people who want to create more housing in our city. Especially the types of housing people say that they support, like capital A affordable housing. We're like, well, we have to play by the land use code rules too. So if you love affordable housing, but you want every 3-bedroom unit to have a gazillion parking spaces, that makes it harder for us to build that housing that you say you support. So, but that's like obviously pretty like nuanced, like everyone who's a practitioner understands that. So we have a lot of educational events to try and kind of break that information down and make it digestible. Chris hosted a great one about the tie-ins between housing and the environment. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think a lot of it starts with talking to people. Kate was saying this the other day. We go out and talk to a lot of people, and the way you get people connected to this idea is you just ask them, are you having a problem affording your rent? Can you make your mortgage? Do you have a family member who can't afford to live here anymore and has to leave? Do you wish one of your friends could move here, but they see the prices and they can't move here? And once you get people talking about their own experiences, it's just, that's the way in, right? And people get to see like, oh, this sucks. It sucks that my friends can't live here with me because it's too expensive. It sucks that my mom has to move out to Greeley. It sucks that I can't afford to make rent this month, right? All these things. And you add, and once you get people talking about that, they realize like, oh, we need to make a change. And I think that's really the beginning of most of the conversation, just asking people how they think things are going and what they're worried about. And inevitably, when you ask people that, they talk about housing.
What, obviously U+2, we all know U+2 very well. And I lived in Los Angeles when I was in my early 20s, and yeah, there's no U+2, put it that way, in Los Angeles. You're living with a bunch of people, and I lived on a futon for a few months. But what is the latest on U+2? And what is, I know Jenny supports basically blowing it up, changing it around.
She does, yeah.
Yeah, what is the latest on U+2 and what's going on with that?
It is on the council agenda for this spring. Okay. And so it's possible that council will address it. It's possible that council could refer it to the ballot. One of the other things that we're watching, though, is that there is a state bill. This is HB 1007 that has passed the state house and is now due for a committee hearing in the state Senate that would prohibit occupancy limits based on family relationship, and that would only allow for occupancy limits that follow international building codes, fire safety standards, and so forth. So we are looking at that also, and there's a chance that the state might solve this problem for us.
Interesting. It's like, do you go state or do you try to do it local and then have that influence the state? It's kind of like,
our tendency is, again, all of the above.
Right.
We're in favor of housing options. We're exploring all of our avenues for creating change in Fort Collins, and we will work on all of them, in some cases simultaneously. We were also talking about potentially doing a ballot measure ourselves on U+2 this fall. So we are looking at our options, watching what's happening at the state level, at the local level, and we're gonna make this happen.
I feel like as somebody's just a dumb mortgage broker, and you guys are way more involved in this. the way to solve this, if there is a solution, is through the programs. Like, you're not good at the values of these homes. I just don't see going down because people love it. And Kate, maybe I'm wrong. Convince me I'm wrong. And I'm just maybe playing devil's advocate here a little bit, because somebody would say Fort Collins is amazing. It's beautiful. We love it for all the reasons that we've already talked about, and people continue to move here. I just feel like that is harder to fight than saying, why not? Like, I wanted to bring up the Bird Whistle townhomes. You guys know the Bird Whistle townhomes?
Not familiar, no.
You should look it up. They're having an open house here next week. It's for affordable housing. And it's actually in South Fort Collins. And you can only buy these townhomes if you're under the AMI or certain income limits. And I look at that as like, okay, there's an idea where, you can't have a bunch of investors come in and buy these townhomes. They're not going to allow it.
Right.
So it's a great, you should look, Bird Whistle townhomes. And I look at that as I go, that idea to me seems like a good solution or a direction. But Kate, I'll let you answer that. The whole value thing, I have a hard time going, God, I just don't see these things coming down, and I could be dead wrong, but who knows?
Well, so that's the thing, right? It matters for the future, looking forward, if the housing market continues to go up 10% a year, or if we're able to slow it down a little bit.
Right.
I referred to bending the curve earlier. Yes, we need deed restricted affordable housing. We need subsidized housing. On the national level, we need Section 8 vouchers. There are all of these tools that we have to help bring down the cost of housing. But it also matters for the future of our community, whether we are able to bend that curve or not. And the more supply that we're able to add to the market, the more it's going to help to kind of bend that curve a little bit and make other options available to people.
We're going to have to use a different analogy than bend the curve. I think that some people have got a negative...
find it triggering.
Wait, what?
Well,
no, I'm not doing no bending of no curve.
But what we can say is that cities that have passed ADU legislation have allowed duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes in single family zones have arrested their rent rises. So no, perhaps the value of the homes haven't gone down, but they have actually managed to slow or stop the rampant rise in rent. Los Angeles, you mentioned, has done this. Portland, Oregon has done this. These cities that have passed a greater flexibility of housing options in single family zones. We're not saying that you can't have a single family home if you don't want to. Great. No one's forcing you to build an ADU. But does that mean that no one in your entire city should be able to because you don't want to build one, when this could have a massive impact on the lives of your neighbors who are still paying rent? It's just you just have to think a little bit outside of yourself in the understanding of this issue. And I think that that's one of the really interesting things about this movement is that, there's a very deep inequality in the kinds of people who advocate for and against pro-housing policy, because we're advocating for someone who has 3 jobs because they're trying to make their rent every month. They don't have time to go sit in city council for 6 hours every Tuesday.
No
we
way.
do. Sometimes more than someone with 3 jobs. So we're really advocating for folks who physically don't have the time to go advocate for themselves. So it's not like we're, patting ourselves on the back, giving a voice to the voiceless. It's that we're actually trying to counteract the time poverty that's being created by the housing crisis as well. It's like it's creating its own problem, because the people who are affected most don't have the tools and time to be able to advocate for themselves in the ways that our city and state governments have set up for them to advocate, which is to go sit in a meeting for hours and hours.
Right. That makes sense.
I'm a perpetual optimist. And if all of these policies don't pass, what are some things such as maybe 3D printing or the Elon Musk 10 foot by 10 foot house? What are some potential future innovations that could provide affordable housing options that maybe aren't being discussed on a day-to-day basis, that is more kind of like concrete? Policies are concrete. Deed restricted affordable housing is concrete. These other kind of alternative options. What are some things that you guys are seeing that might actually, make a wave in the future?
I mean, modular construction is useless if I don't have a site that I can put those 80 units on, right? It all comes back to land use for me. there are tons of innovative construction technologies out there. We could talk about, 3D printing concrete houses. There's an entire neighborhood of homes like that in Austin, but they have to have the land to put those houses on. So every solution is only as good as the physical space those solutions can occupy.
Yeah,
And
tiny homes couldn't be built because of because of the land use code there.
Exactly.
Exactly. And I think it really gets back to the fundamental thing that I think is happening, which is that discussions about housing are almost never actually about housing. They're about people, right? They're about who's going to get to live in my neighborhood, right? They're about what kind of town are we going to be? And that's the reason, like, I'm ultimately optimistic that Fort Collins is going to we're going to be able to come together and get through these problems, is that Fort Collins isn't a kind of place where people have something that they love and they think, I want to keep it all for myself and I don't want to share it. I think we're the kind of town, like to what Chris was speaking to, we have this great place. We see that there's this amazing style of life, the hiking, and our instinct, I think, fundamentally isn't to hoard it. It's to share it and say, you should come and be with us. It is great to live here. Like, I want you to. And so I think that's fundamentally why we are going to solve this in Fort Collins and in Colorado in general. I just think it's about reminding people what's at stake and reminding them kind of the better angels of their nature, that they can kind of rise to that, I think. But there's no way but through, I think, to Kate's point. You got to just,
you got to put it somewhere.
Exactly. And if the neighbors are going to be able to say, no, I don't want that kind of house in my neighborhood, and they're going to have the power to say, if 5 neighbors are going to say, I don't want those kind of homes, or I don't want those kind of people in my neighborhood, you got to just win the argument.
I might also say that I think there are also economies of scale when it comes to something like ADUs. Mm-hmm. So if you legalize ADUs statewide in Colorado and all along the Front Range, you're going to have companies sprouting up who specialize in the kinds of ADUs that are going into these neighborhoods and who can help bring down those costs. So that is something that I'm hopeful for. It's not a futuristic technology. Prefabricated housing has been around for a very, very long time. It's just about making them legal, like Kate says, and we could start to see companies in this space that are innovating, bringing down the cost, coming up with beautiful designs for these kinds of products.
And to echo that, even with stick built, I was just talking to a home builder the other day who is coming up with a 800 square foot, 2-bed, 1-bath, like cottage, basically, and trying to make use of smaller sites and make a more affordable home product. And I was like, gosh, wouldn't it be sweet if it was legal to do cottage clusters and you could put 16 of those on one site, and then a home builder isn't building 800 square feet at a time. They're building 16 times 800 square feet at a time, and they get economies of scale with every trade that's on that site, rather than doing these little one-off tiny units spread all over the city.
I totally agree, Kate. I think that's how you got to get those laws changed. I mean, I think that's where you're going to make the biggest impact. Is you're right, because Patrick and I have talked about this. It's like, they pass ADUs and it costs a couple $100,000 to build an ADU, Peter, right, to your point. And it's like, who's going to fork over the cash to do that? And let's say you build 100 of them in town. Okay, now you helped out 200 people. Like long term, if this is going from 175 to 250,000, got to think a little bit bigger and how you're going to accompodate that. But
that said, an ADU is also putting a kitchen in your basement.
Yeah,
that's
true.
An ADU.
Yeah,
which is also illegal now. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a detached structure sitting in your backyard that your neighbors can see. But even that is illegal currently.
Yeah, and that could still cost you $50,000. Who knows?
Sure.
But what is your as we kind of wrap everything up? What is your goals this year as a team, you guys? Like, what are you looking? We talked about U+2. I wanted to get to. I love the parking mandate. I thought that was fascinating. Talking about the parking mandate, I got some interesting stories about friends in San Francisco talking about cars and parking. It's one of the biggest wastes of space in the country. But that's for another day. But just kind of going to go around the horn and what are your goals and kind of what are you working towards right now to try to make an impact?
I feel like we can all answer.
Yeah. This is for everybody. Peter, Peter, how about you start?
Yeah, go for it, Peter.
So, we are looking at, Keith mentioned this already, but council is looking at passing a stripped down version of the land use code. There are still a lot of things that we're very excited about in that code and that we'll be watching closely. And we'll be at those council meetings advocating for, what we can around the margins. We're hoping that council comes back to a number of these issues later on, things like occupancy and so forth. And in the meantime, we're also, of course, looking at the state level. One thing to keep in mind, the state legislative session ends, I believe, in the first week of May. So that's a good time to kind of turn your attention from Denver back to Fort Collins. So we're going to be able to know, what is it that the state managed to get done? What are we looking at? And what do we need the city to do? So, but parking minimums is very near and dear to our heart. It's one of the issues that we're completely obsessed with. Occupancy is a crucial priority for us. So, and some of these are counterintuitive. Like, I know everyone on this podcast understands this, but our listeners might not. That parking policy is housing policy. I mentioned the 140 Oak project earlier. That is a 5-story, 100% deed-restricted affordable housing development in the heart of Fort Collins, which sounds amazing, and it is amazing. But they had to build a 1.5-story parking garage inside that development in the most central location, most transit-friendly, walkable location in Fort Collins. That's a lot of money that went into concrete to make cars fly. Why do we have an affordable housing crisis in this country? It's because we're trying to park cars on the second floor of those affordable housing developments. So, these are all issues that don't seem to be directly related to housing, but they make us more competitive for those affordable housing grants, and they help us to build more units to house more people.
Christopher, you can go next. What is your goal this year? Or or you just add on to it? Maybe you answered it for everybody, Peter. I don't know.
Yeah, I think our goal is to push through as many of these state housing bills in the spring as we can. I do think that a significant part of the movement we're going to see is going to happen at the state level based on the experience of other states. So we're going to push as hard as we can while the state is still in session to get those passed. And then we're going to turn our focus back to the land use code. But I think more in general, like we keep coming back to, right? It's about reaching people. It's about talking to people, and it's about connecting the dots for them, right? Why is it that Fort Collins has the housing costs that it does? Can it be different? And kind of connecting with those people and letting them know that they do have the power to make the change that to the community that they love, like if they come together and get organized. And so I think that's always our goal, is just to keep reaching out to more and more people and letting them know that what is happening in the city now is not normal. It's not the city I grew up in, and that there's things we can do about it.
I love it. I didn't know about your organization until Patrick told me about it. And I was like, I was researching it. I won't get into the Reddit. I was reading a bunch of stuff on Reddit. We won't even get into that.
Oh, dear.
I was like, went down that rabbit hole. I was like, oh my God. All right, we're just going to stop reading those comments.
I don't know if it's worth saying this, but we were prepared to go to the ballot with the land use code. If that's what council decided to do, to refer it to the ballot, we were ready to do that. Patrick mentioned earlier the burden of educating people about these issues. It is so hard to educate people about what is actually in the 500-page land use code. It is just a more difficult sell. And to be completely frank, I think Preserve Fort Collins was dishonest in its campaign about what was actually in that code and what was at stake for Fort Collins. This was a very modest set of changes that would allow a little bit of density around the margins. Like the 52% increase in density that Preserve Fort Collins was talking about was not there. It's not in the code that was passed, and not in the changes that were reflected in these code reforms. So one of the things that I'm hoping for in the new year is that, just like on the state level, they've started to address these things in a more piecemeal fashion, we can start to do that here in Fort Collins as well. And I think that will also make for better conversations around housing. If things need to go to the ballot, I would much rather have a ballot measure on ADUs than a ballot measure on the entire 500-page land use code that people are picking up and trying to read and finding things that they don't like that were actually in the previous code. Like it just makes
they could wrap their head around that much easier than
our job as activists so much easier. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping for going into the rest of this year after the state legislative session ends in May, that we can start to have more real conversations about specific housing types in our community.
It's so much harder to scare people about like grandma living in an apartment in the garage than it is about like gigantic apartment complexes or stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you make it
theoretically, you could take these two houses, you could wipe them off the planet Earth, and then raise it and put 35 units right here, right?
Exactly. It's like, no, my grandma wants to live downstairs. Is mostly what's really happening. It's like so much more the reality of the situation.
Completely.
Well, guys, we finish each episode with this is Fort Collins, great place to live, microbrew capital of the world. And after all the politics that you guys are involved with, you guys have to somehow relax. Where do you guys go find yourselves enjoying a cold one on a Friday afternoon?
Oh, I have too many answers to that question.
Fire away.
Well, I'm going to say Odell and Horse and Dragon because they are both incredible pro-housing organizations themselves.
Love Horse and Dragon. Love Odell.
I have to say, I have a baby now. So I have a 10-month-old daughter at home, and we love to go hang out at the New Belgium patio. I know it's not a microbrewery answer, but it's just so kid-friendly, dog-friendly. It's a real treat to get to hang out outdoors and enjoy a beer there.
They like AstroTurf, the grass they have there with the new stage and everything. They did a great job with that.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. There are always food trucks there. It's a great place to hang out if you have a family. The other thing I have to say is I have to shout out Old Town Mugs, which is my favorite hangout in the city. I don't think it would be Fort Collins without that place. I am a coffee shop goer.
Right.
Every day, all day. So that's the place that I hang out the most.
Yeah, mine's definitely Rally King, which is like where we have our Friday afternoon club after work on Fridays. So that's
haven't heard that one too often.
Well, you're right there
it's
at
smaller.
Ridgeview, so
it's delicious. I gotta shout out Horse and Dragon too, just like Kate, because they're such housing people. And then Tap and Handle's my neighborhood bar. So
Tap and Handle's great. Well, I got a 13-month-old Peter, so I'm right there with you. So to the new dads out there,
I thought you guys would be at the bar more than ever. I thought I'd see you every night down there.
Yeah, the sleep has gone down, the alcohol intake has gone up. It's the trade-off. That's how it works. Well, I gotta thank you guys so much for coming on. Talking about education, I got some education and reading about what you're doing and definitely look into the Bird Whistle townhomes. I'm going to an event there next week, and I'm really fascinated to hear more about that. And I like that idea, and I think you guys would really kind of like to dive into that too. So
we could have a whole podcast about affordable home ownership models another time.
All righty, guys. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Friends of the podcast, thank you so much as always for tuning in. We thank you so much for your support. And just so you know, my amazing co-host Patrick Soukup over there, he is the founder, started Soukup Real Estate. If you ever need any questions about buying or selling or just want a market report on your existing home, reach out to Patrick. His team is absolutely fantastic. Born and raised in Fort Collins. His information is right there on the page. Strongly recommend reaching out.
And same for you, Chris. As if you guys are looking at buying or refinancing a home here in Northern Colorado, there's nobody better to reach out to than the Murphy Whitlock Group. And Chris Murphy is going to take incredible care of you. So do not hesitate to reach out, ask questions. He is in no rush, no hurry. So give him a chance. And I think he's going to do a great job for you. Thank you for watching.